In southern Poland, about 60 kilometers from Krakow, stood the Nazis' biggest concentration and extermination complex, Auschwitz.
The location contained concentration camps, labor camps, and an extermination site.
Auschwitz is the largest cemetery in Europe and probably the largest one on the planet.
Composed of 3 main camps, including Birkenau, and about 30 subcamps in 100 square kilometers, the compound saw 1,300,000 deportees from all over Europe. 80% never made it out.
The initial project of 10,000 inmates at Auschwitz quickly grew to 200,000 prisoners.
Conceived as a model city to accommodate German settlers, Auschwitz was to include a gigantic industrial complex to produce rubber and synthetic oil for aviation, becoming the centerpiece of Hitler's policy.
The idea was to make it a Nazi city that was an example and a major protagonist of the colonization of the East.
The ambitious project quickly degenerated into the cornerstone of the final solution.
The pinnacle of Birkenau's activity was during the deportation of Jews from Hungary. It's estimated that up to 12,000 people were murdered every day.
At the end of the war, much of Auschwitz was either destroyed by the Nazis, eroded by time, or gradually forgotten. But some remains are still visible today.
In the gas chamber, which was downstairs, for one time, they could place over 2,000 people.
Now, through exclusive access to the Auschwitz camps, CGI reconstructions, as well as the testimony of survivors, exceptional documents, and unique photos in the history of the camps, you're about to bear witness to the implacable evolution of the Auschwitz project, spearheaded by the Third Reich.
There's a whole story shrouding these images in mystery. They're among the most extraordinary in the history of photography.
The Auschwitz album is a very, very important discovery because usually it was forbidden to take photos in these camps.
More than 7 decades after the liberation, this investigation delves into the traces of history's most dreadful concentration camp and extermination complex, the universal symbol of the Holocaust. At the dawn of the Second World War, the conquest of Europe by Nazi Germany was underway. Adolf Hitler's goal was to make the Third Reich the most powerful empire in the world.
For the Third Reich, the stakes were ideological. On one hand, to reconquer territories that were claimed as German, and on the other, all the territories up to Moscow that were meant to constitute the empire, the Reich in the true sense of the term, with projects that aimed at colonizing a huge chunk of Eastern Europe.
As proof of Hitler's extreme determination, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were annexed in just 18 months. In September 1939, after the invasion of the German-speaking European countries, the war became global as the project of the Great Reich, wanted by the Führer, became unbridled. But how to enslave the populations to build this gigantic empire and make the Nazi doctrine and the Aryan race prosper?
As soon as Hitler came to power, large concentration camps saw the day in Germany.
The concentration camps were primarily designed by the Nazis to bring the German populations to heel, and the concentration camp system developed in the 1930s featured a dozen camps at the beginning of World War II.
After building concentration camps in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, and Ravensbrück in Germany, then in Mauthausen in Austria, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, decided to create others. This time, a city about 60 kilometers from Krakow in Upper Silesia in southern Poland caught his attention. Auschwitz, or Auschwitz in German.
Upper Silesia was the historic eastern tip of Germany in its greatest extensions. To Himmler, Auschwitz became the flag bearer of the reconquest to the east.
Colonization in the east was to be done by settlement nuclei, or settlement cities. Among these cities was Auschwitz. The idea was to make it a Nazi city that was an example and a major protagonist of the colonization of the East.
Auschwitz enjoyed very advantageous conditions. The surrounding land was fertile, and the coal mines were numerous. In addition, the site was located in the heart of a very dense railway junction with connections to Berlin, Kiev, Warsaw, and Budapest.
Very quickly, the SS realized that Auschwitz was connected to all of Europe by rail, which obviously made it a very important location. Parallel to this urban project, you had a concentration camp that opened at the same time in the suburbs, which aimed at terrorizing and bringing to heel the Polish populations, not only of the city, but of the entire region.
The location was deemed ideal by Himmler, who ordered the creation of the first of a series of camps in Poland. The decision to turn one of them into an extermination center would follow.
Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp complex born of Nazi policy. It embodied all the Nazi policies as they evolved during the Second World War. The location featured both concentration camps, labor camps, as well as an extermination site.
On the outskirts of the Old Town, 3 main camps were successively set up. In May 1940, 2 kilometers to the southwest, the main camp, called Auschwitz von Stammlager, immediately became one of the most important in the Nazi concentration camp system. In October 1941, 3 kilometers to the northwest and 20 times larger, Auschwitz II Birkenau was created and also included an extermination zone. A year later, approximately 10 kilometers to the east, Auschwitz III Monowitz was built, a camp intended to provide the workforce for a huge industrial pole. Together, they formed an area of economic interest of about 40 square kilometers, the equivalent of a city the size of Lyon. The figures were absolutely dizzying, especially since Himmler's gigantic complex wasn't limited to these impressive infrastructures. Beyond this perimeter, on a territory 3 times larger, about 30 annex camps were built, always in proximity to factories and mines.
The Auschwitz site was constantly under construction, and that was still the case when the Red Army landed in 1945.
This large-scale project would transform the region and leave many traces, vestiges which are still visible today. It all began in May 1940 with the development of Auschwitz I on the site of former Polish military barracks. The camp consisted of a villa for the commander and 3 buildings for the SS. Behind a double barbed wire fence were 28 blocks for the prisoners. Away from the city, the site offered enough space to construct multiple annex buildings to lock up an ever-increasing number of detainees from the new territories occupied by Nazi Germany. It also housed a garrison that constantly increased in size and huge factory floors that produced everything the site required.
The initial project was for 10,000 inmates at Auschwitz, but the expansion and incessant needs of the camp quickly resulted in 30,000 prisoners.
In the early stages, the prisoners of the camp in Auschwitz were Polish people, with the elite of Polish society being overrepresented among the very first victims.
Political militants, intellectuals, students, Jews, and other categories of victims of Nazi persecution were gradually brought in from all over Europe. Upon their arrival at the camp, all were confronted with extreme violence.
The conditions were dreadful. Mistreatment, hunger, disease, so much so that some 70,000 Polish prisoners died in the Auschwitz I camp alone.
Le camp d'Auschwitz I.
A terror, the traces of which are detailed in a report secretly transmitted to the resistance by Witold Pilecki, a Polish officer who was voluntarily captured and imprisoned in Auschwitz in September 1940, so he could bear witness of the treatment inflicted on the detainees.
The door of our wagon was violently opened, and we were blinded by lights. Heraus, raus, raus. They screamed at us. The SS struck our shoulders, backs, and heads with the butt of their guns. We had to get out quickly. 10 men were randomly taken out of the ranks and shot. The corpses were dragged using straps attached to one foot. The dogs were excited by the blood and were released on the bodies. The SS laughed.
Inside the camp, detainees were stripped naked, shaved, and pushed into a large communal shower room. The process of Nazi dehumanization was cleverly orchestrated.
The real purpose of the shower was actually to terrorize the prisoners from the first hours. They have to undress, they were naked, then they were pushed into the room with the water. But the water was either icy cold or boiling hot. It was an occasion for beating, kicking, abusing, and basically the rapid and very fast introduction into the system of terror here in the camp.
After receiving their striped uniform and a pair of clogs, the prisoners joined one of the blocks intended for them.
Originally, 700 prisoners were to be accommodated in each building. But as the camp was overcrowded constantly, usually 1,000 was in each.
Fed 200 grams of bread and a bowl of soup, prisoners received no more than 1,000 calories per day, 2/3 of the minimum daily needs.
So starvation came very early. It caused that they started to eat whatever they found around, and eating old, spoiled food caused that they were suffering from diarrhea. In a few weeks' time, the prisoners were dying.
But how could the SS mistreat so many people without fear of revolt when the detainees were far more numerous than the jailers? Once again, the system was designed from the outset to break any hint of rebellion.
The Nazis' Machiavellian system consisted in having the daily lives of the detainees managed by other detainees. To that end, they often used prisoners arrested for genuine crimes, such as killers and thieves. Some were criminals, capable of incredible brutality and violence, especially since they were given power over the others.
Just like the blocks and showers where torture was a daily occurrence, roll call was also an essential cog in the concentration camp infrastructure.
Every morning and every evening, the prisoners were to be counted. If the number was not correct, the roll call was very long. So they were waiting, they were counting and counting and counting again. So for example, one of the roll calls lasted here for 19 hours.
These detainees, already exhausted by forced labor and malnutrition, were forced to stand, regardless of the weather conditions and extreme cold. Sometimes inmates died during roll call. All survivors' stories evoke the experience of the roll call, no matter the camp.
The slightest signs of weakness or attempted escape by the prisoners were immediately repressed. As on this gallows, where 12 were hanged in front of their comrades, as an example. When the sentence was not immediately executed, it was the responsibility of another service specially dedicated to repression, which had established its quarters at the tip of the camp in the sinister Block 11, nicknamed the Death Block.
Prisoners who were blamed for breaking some rules of the camp, they were arrested and they were first taken for block number 11. There were also sessions of the Gestapo court. They were to deal with the civilian cases.
Block 11 was a kind of prison within the prison. But inside these walls, cells were set up where prisoners were tortured, even more so than in the camp itself.
Martyrisés encore plus qu'ils ne le sont dans le camp lui-même.
The basement of Block 11 housed 28 cramped cells. Number 22 consisted of 4 isolation cells, less than 1 square meter each. Inmates entered on all fours through a tiny, low door. They were locked up in groups of 4, if not more, and forced to stand with an orifice the size of a pack of cigarettes, the sole source of air.
Punishment was between 5 and 10 nights. And in the morning, after the whole night of standing, they were released and they were to join their working unit. Those who survived the cells are saying that they became so tired, exhausted, so they could hardly bear the next night and continue till the end of the punishment.
This was a place where the purpose of detention was to literally break those held in there. From a punitive point of view, some were also imprisoned there before being executed.
In this building, thousands of victims designated by the Gestapo were tried and sentenced to death, either by lethal injection or by bullet in the nearby courtyard.
Here in front of us, we've got the execution yard, place where thousands of men, women, and also children were shot. They were taken here for the screen and shot with the gun into the back of their heads.
In September 1941, the very first gassings with Zyklon B, a deadly pesticide made up of hydrogen cyanide, were tested in the basement of Block 11.
Zyklon B, also known as prussic acid, was previously used to exterminate insects in warehouses. It was tested by the SS on 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 Poles.
This was the first time that the SS gassed with Zyklon B at Auschwitz, and they weren't sure how to do it. They sketchily barricaded the basement and tried to obstruct most of the windows in Block 11. The Polish and Soviet detainees designated for this gassing agonized for 3 days and 3 nights.
With this event, Auschwitz, which had only been a concentration camp among others up until then, took the first step towards its transformation into a death camp. The second step occurred in the old ammunition depot of the barracks, where a new gas chamber was created. It was equipped with a crematorium to get rid of the bodies, the K1.
The capacity of the crematorium was per day, they could burn over 400 bodies. But as we know, the number was very often doubled. The nationalities of the people who are burned here is great variety. The first would be the Polish people. Then we started to bring here Soviet prisoners of war, Czech prisoners. And after 1942, when the mass extermination of the Jewish people started, also their bodies were burned here.
In 5 years of operation, Auschwitz I swallowed up the lives of several thousand Czech deportees, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and more than 70,000 Poles. Despite the many buildings added to the camp, it couldn't cope with the flows of deportees expected by the Nazi regime. In winter of 1941, 3 kilometers to the west, Heinrich Himmler ordered the construction of a new camp over the raised village of Czesinka. It would become the largest concentration camp and the most important extermination center of the Nazi regime, Auschwitz II Birkenau.
Initially, the construction of Birkenau was decided in the context of the invasion of the USSR known as Operation Barbarossa. The objective was to house up to 200,000 Soviet prisoners of war who would provide manpower for all the projects developed at Auschwitz.
The more the war progressed, the more ambitious Nazi policies turned out to be, their projects becoming ever more monumental.
Des plans de plus en plus pharaoniques.
The Birkenau site was a perfect illustration.
Initially designed to hold 100,000 and then 200,000 Soviet prisoners before the genocide of European Jews was planned, the disproportionate size of the camp continued to evolve. In its final configuration, it formed a huge rectangle, 2.4 kilometers long and 700 meters wide, to which was added an extension intended for extermination, all enclosed by 16 kilometers of electrified barbed wire. This area represented more than 175 hectares, or 238 soccer fields, divided into 3 parts. B1, composed of 2 camps, B2, consisting of 6 camps, and the never-completed B3 extension called Mexico. To house the inmates, 300 of the 600 buildings originally planned were built by the prisoners themselves. Today, only the chimneys of the wooden barracks and the brick blocks have withstood dismantling and the test of time.
The Birkenau camp was built by the first Soviet prisoners of war. The construction occurred in absolutely appalling conditions, to the point that all of those prisoners of war died during the construction of the camp.
The village that was there initially was dismantled, and the recovered materials were used to build the B1 unit. B2 and then B3 were built by the other prisoners, who replaced the Soviets starting in 1942. This was a permanent construction site with a whole set of buildings erected around it. A garrison for the SS, a hospital for the SS, and all the structures related to water and electricity. Not so much for the prisoners, but for the SS.
But the blitzkrieg hoped for by Hitler on the Russian front dragged on. This military and economic failure for Nazi Germany marked a turning point in the outcome of the war, as well as the future of the camp.
The halt of the German military advance in the Soviet Union meant that the Soviet workforce didn't arrive. Therefore, it had to be replaced by other populations.
On January 25, 1942, with 5 million Jews already under the thumb of the Third Reich, and the high Nazi dignitaries having just planned the final solution at a secret conference in Wannsee, Himmler informed the management of the Birkenau camp that 150,000 Jews would be deported there to die on the job as forced laborers. In the spring, the first convoys left from France and Slovakia.
In a pivotal moment that lasted just a few months, they decided that the Jews would be sent there to die en masse without being murdered. This gave momentum to an aspect of the final solution.
6 months later, in July 1942, the Nazi regime decided for the first time not only to exploit Jewish labor, but also to murder all those deemed unfit for work upon their arrival at the camp. Like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, Birkenau became an extermination center.
It must be noted that the killing centers, the assassination locations set up by the Nazis for the final solution, were all regional. Treblinka, for example, was an assassination center for the Jews of Warsaw. The only place devoted to the annihilation of all European Jews was Auschwitz.
To receive the incessant tide of deportees, 2 station platforms were successively built. The first in the spring of 1942, 1 kilometer from Auschwitz I and 600 meters from the entrance to Birkenau. It bore the sinister name of Judenrampe, or Ramp of the Jews. In just 2 years, 500,000 men, women, and children arrived here never to return. The second platform, called Bahnrampe, was built in May 1944 and operated for only a few months, yet it became the most emblematic of the Holocaust. It led to the interior of the camp, where 3 tracks allowed several convoys to enter simultaneously right to the gates of the gas chambers.
Each convoy that unloaded its human cargo held between 1,000 and 3,500 people who walked the platform where the train stopped before being handled by the SS.
In just 6 weeks, 430,000 Hungarian Jews landed on this platform.
The Hungarian action proved to be the biggest simple mass extermination of people in the history of the Auschwitz concentration camp.
This was the moment when an assassination center that had already swallowed almost 500,000 people changed to one that participated in the destruction of 1 million people.
At the rate of 4 or 5 convoys per day, this represented a crowd of up to 15,000 people arriving daily. In tribute to the victims, this freight car, a vestige of this horrendous period in European history, has been preserved.
These cattle cars we may see here, they were produced to transport some goods, transport some animals, first of all. So absolutely not for people. But in a wartime, when the Germans started the deportation of the Jewish people, they were using whatever transport was available. So the conditions were catastrophic.
We left on a Sunday morning and were close to 100 in the cattle car. Half were standing and the other half were sitting on a friend's lap. We took turns getting up so that everyone could sit down. We were very, very tight, and our car had no windows. There were shutters that were closed. The air and the light only passed through the poorly nailed planks. It was dreadful.
Upon arrival, the deportees had no idea of what awaited them. In this photo taken in the spring of 1944 of a convoy of Hungarian Jews getting off the train after 3 or 4 days of travel, one can perceive relief on the faces of some.
To me, no deportee could ever forget this arrival. They unlocked the doors. We had traveled without air or light. Everyone had done their business. You could imagine the smell. So when the doors were opened, I felt an incredible relief. I could finally breathe. Our train entered the gates of death and slowly went to the end of the camp. And when the doors were unlocked, we were told to move it and jump out. You couldn't get yourself noticed or shout. Only the SS were yelling.
These extremely rare images are the only known to date of an active death camp. They were taken from the Auschwitz album, an exceptional collection of 197 photos found at the German camp of Dora Mittelbau in April 1945.
The Auschwitz album, called Lily Jacobs' album, after the survivor who found it, is a central piece from both an historical and memorial point of view.
There we have the image of the crowds of Jews going to the gas chamber. This is how we can fully grasp the scope of the process of the killing of the Jews at this oversized camp.
In Jerusalem, Israel, the photos are carefully preserved at the Yad Vashem Holocaust History Museum.
The Auschwitz album is a very, very important discovery because usually it was forbidden to take photos in these camps. In the first section, there are photos with the arrival of people with disembarking from the trains, and they await the orders from the SS. Then the next section shows the selection of the people.
In these photos, the SS, assisted by prisoners in striped uniforms, divide the arrivals into 4 lines, 2 towards the camp's entrance watchtowers and 2 opposite. The convoy is then separated to free a passage to an alley that crossed the camp. In the center, a dozen SS, armed and equipped with canes, begin the selection.
The selection was to separate the young, healthy people, those who could be still used as slave labor, and they were to be separated from elderly people, invalids, disabled, children, mothers with children.
Selection was a process peculiar to Auschwitz, where the SS, in need of manpower for the Auschwitz project, decided to temporarily spare a small number of Jews initially sent there to be murdered. There was no apparent logic. In a second, they ascertained whether someone was more or less in good physical condition and fit to work.
While everything seemed to happen calmly in these photos, the operation rarely went smoothly.
The pictures show the perspective of the SS. I mean, you don't see any heartbreaking scenes. You don't see any people collapsing or, what you would usually imagine when you think about photos being taken at an extermination camp.
The photos were taken by 2 SS photographers from Auschwitz. They were extremely staged by the SS. Any trace of violence was erased, and they showed scenes they wanted to show. The objective of the album was to show Himmler that the deportation of the Jews from Hungary took place smoothly and was very well managed by the SS.
The deportees deemed unfit for work, yet able to move, then began a march towards the gas chambers and crematoriums located away from the camp. Either by the main road, called Hauptstrasse, to the crematoriums 2 and 3, less than 500 meters away, or by the Lagerstrasse, which crossed the camp to crematoriums 4 and 5, more than 1 kilometer away.
About 80% of the Jews were immediately put to death. They didn't even come in. They were deported to Auschwitz, but they never got to know it.
Some convoys were completely destroyed. Starting in May 1942, there were convoys that were 100% annihilated.
Pictures taken in the small birch woods northwest of the camp show people waiting. They had no idea that they would be murdered in the next few minutes.
The last photos were for the SS to show how efficient their system of deception was, to show how the Jews were completely fooled to the end. What's out of frame behind the photographer were the 2 gas chambers in the perimeter of the birchwoods, crematoriums 4 and 5.
Despite the number of photos in the album, some of the camp's buildings hardly ever appear, those specially designed for mass murder.
The first gassing in Birkenau took place on 2 farms that remained from the dismantled Polish village. Those were sealed, made airtight, and nicknamed Bunkers 1 and 2 by the SS.
They just gassed them. They gassed them and then removed the bodies and covered them with lime in pits near those 2 houses, both of which were destroyed.
Of the first 2 gas chambers built in 1942 to the west and northwest of the camp, almost nothing remains. The foundations of Bunker 2 show a building of about 120 square meters, divided into 4 airtight rooms.
At the end of 1942, it posed a problem, especially because Auschwitz was a city intended for German settlers. In addition, German garrisons of SS were everywhere, and the dead bodies threatened the groundwater table.
The big problem for the Nazis wasn't killing, it was the bodies. That's where the idea of building huge crematory gas chambers came from. These integrated installations that allowed for a sort of assembly line.
The SS carried out the assassination and destruction of the bodies in the same place, the same building. It was at this moment that Auschwitz started to become an increasingly sophisticated assassination site.
In bunkers 1 and 2, historians estimate that 150,000 to 200,000 people were murdered. With the construction of the new gas chambers put into operation in 1943, K4 and K5 north of the camp, and K2 and K3 at the end of the ramp, Birkenau became the site of the greatest genocide in human history.
What we may see here behind me, there are ruins of gas chamber and crematorium number 2. In the gas chamber, which was downstairs, for one time they could place over 2,000 people. Then here in the crematorium, German company built 5 furnaces, and per day they could burn officially 1,400 corpses. Officially, because the number was very often higher, as they were overusing the furnaces.
In the new extermination complexes, everything was thought out to the smallest detail. At the twin crematoriums 2 and 3, the victims first entered an underground room to undress before taking an alleged shower. On the walls, numbered hooks made it possible to hang clothes in order to suggest they would be easily recoverable. Then the deportees were pushed into the fictitious 210 square meter shower room equipped with false shower heads and mesh columns from floor to ceiling. From there, crystals of Zyklon B were poured into hatches.
But this time, the German soldiers were climbing on the roof. They were wearing masks to protect them from the gas. So they were to open the metal boxes, open the chimney, and drop the content into this chimney. So the people who were close to those chimneys were dying very quickly.
In theory, and this is a very macabre theory, it takes about 20 minutes or 18 minutes at the most appropriate temperature for Zyklon B to kill someone.
After the exhausting of the gas through the ventilation system and the opening of the doors, the victim's hair was shaved and the bodies transferred upstairs by an elevator. A dissection room was used to recover gold teeth or carry out experiments before the bodies were cremated in one of the 5 huge furnaces. During the massacre of the Jews of Hungary, the crematoriums operated day and night.
The pinnacle of Birkenau's activity occurred during the deportation of Jews from Hungary in the second quarter of 1944. It was estimated that up to 12,000 people were murdered every day. So that's 12,000 people slaughtered and their bodies burned in the process.
The ashes of the dead were thrown into the nearby Vistula River. Sometimes they were also used as fertilizer or to fill roads along with bone remains. In drawings done upon his release, David Oler, a Jewish prisoner who survived the Sonderkommandos, described very precisely how the crematoriums worked.
Sonderkommandos were detainees who were appointed to participate in the logistical organization of murder.
It was these prisoners who were in charge of the dirty work, namely bringing the victims to the gas chambers, cutting their hair, collecting their clothing, and above all, carrying the bodies afterwards and taking them to the piers or the crematoriums.
The Sonderkommandos were bound to secrecy in that they were isolated from the rest of the detainees. They were regularly executed by the SS.
Despite the absolute secrecy that weighed on this part of the camp devoted to the gassing of the deportees, 4 photos were taken by members of a Sonderkommando. At great risk to their lives, Alberto Herrera and a handful of Polish resistance fighters managed to bring into the death zone a camera found among the property confiscated from the prisoners.
The taking of the pictures by Alberto Herrera and a small resistance group within the Sonderkommando was part of a desire to testify. These photos speak to what was happening in Birkenau in the gas chambers.
Obviously, taking pictures meant risking one's life. But since they thought they would be executed, the issue of putting their lives in danger might not have been the most important. What was important was for the world to know. The world needed to know. And an image allows you to have a physical, material trace of what's happening.
The first 2 photos taken in the direction of the forest show a group of women, some of whom are naked.
This photo was taken blindly, hinting at the extreme discomfort of the photographer who took it. But when you look carefully, you see several women, some of whom were already undressed and walking to the left of the frame, probably towards crematorium 4. So this is the beginning of the gassing operation.
The next 2 photographs show the cremation of corpses in an open-air pit.
Just by looking at the image, you can see it's taken from inside a building, and it shows the Sonderkommandos at work, namely bringing the bodies into the open pits. The SS were omnipresent during these cremation operations. You can actually see one of them in one of the 2 photos. The current location still has 2 adjacent watchtowers. So the place where the photographer is hiding, which is a terrifying thought, is the gas chamber itself, which was the only safe spot for a member of the Sonderkommando to hide from the SS.
These images, taken in conditions of total secrecy, are perhaps the most significant traces of the horror perpetrated at Auschwitz. They reveal a fragment of the reality of the Holocaust that was never meant to be revealed.
Once the photos were taken, they had to take the film out of the camera. They had to hide the device. The film had to be taken outside the Sonderkommando area and then out of the camp. And once outside, it had to be taken to people who would be able to keep it safe.
The film extracted from the camera is believed to have been smuggled out of Auschwitz in a tube of toothpaste. It reached the Polish resistance in Krakow on September 4th, 1944. In the collections of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, carefully preserved away from light and moisture, another trace hidden by the Birkenau Sonderkommandos has resurfaced.
There are notes written by one of the members of the Sonderkommando, include 12 pages written in Greek language.
This manuscript, hidden in a bottle buried 30 centimeters deep near crematorium 3, was randomly found in 1980. Rendered illegible by moisture, it would take 30 years before the advances in computer science could reveal the manuscript's horrid secret.
The author of these notes is Marcel Nadjari. He arrived in the camp in April 1944, and he described very detailed the activity of the Sonderkommando.
We transport the corpses of these innocent women and children to the elevator that carries them to the oven room. That's where they're burned without any fuel because of the fat they contain. Between 600,000 Hungarian, French, and Polish Jews, and now about 10,000 Czech Jews have just arrived. The tragedy my eyes have seen is indescribable.
To date, half a dozen testimonies buried by Sonderkommandos have been found. Nearly 1,000 were forced to work in the death zone. The deportees who were not sent straight to the gas chambers were directed to another building, the one intended for forced laborers, the central sauna.
I was pushed into a room where they undressed us. It was an awful experience.
Once naked, the deportees had to walk a long corridor to the shaving room, where they were completely shaved before being tattooed.
She gave me a very small number. I'm A16696. When she made a mistake, she put a cross on it and put the right number above it. That's a lot of holes.
Yvette and the other women were then directed to the shower room. The only photo of this step depicts male prisoners with shoes in their hands, the only memory of their former life. In the next room, the deportees received their prisoner's outfit disinfected in large vats. They were ready for forced labor.
Treating a convoy, as the SS put it, took 3 to 4 hours depending on the location and the fate to which they were assigned.
Other photos exist that were taken by the Allies on aerial reconnaissance missions. Did they know what was going on at Auschwitz? In this photograph of the Royal Air Force, dated August 23, 1944, you can clearly see the ramp where the trains arrived. Gas chambers 2, 3, 4, and 5, as well as a plume of smoke from the incineration pits. Across from the central sauna where Yvette and Jeanette were shaved was a group of barracks called Canada.
Canada, here in the camp, is a part where the personal effects of the people murdered in the gas chambers were kept before they were shipped for Germany.
For the Nazis, all Jewish goods had to benefit the Reich. The deportees' belongings were collected directly on the ramp where they had been left. A commando of prisoners loaded them onto trucks and transported them to Canada, where they were sorted. Today, tons of these objects, abandoned by the Nazis during the evacuation of the camp, are kept behind the huge windows of Block 4 of the Auschwitz Museum.
These objects tell us many things. First, it's the last trace of the victims who were murdered there and who totally disappeared. Second, these piles of belongings that are still visible, some with names on them like the suitcases, show the extent of the crimes committed in Auschwitz.
In addition to the death zone and the camp was an intense work area where perpetual construction took place. Between 1940 and 1944, the Nazis exploited prisoners with a view to building research laboratories, farms, arms factories, and coal mines. In the Auschwitz area of interest and its surroundings, up to 60 square kilometers, more than 40 subcamps were created to house this slave workforce. The largest of these, located 8 kilometers east of Birkenau, was called Auschwitz III Monowitz.
Monowitz was the camp attached to the Buna Velka factory. Almost all of its prisoners were Jews. It's estimated that at least 15,000 people were detained there in 1944.
The inmates of the Monowitz camp, over which houses stand today, were assigned to the construction of the largest chemical plant in Europe, Buna Velka. This complex, part of which still remains, covered over 350 hectares.
Buna was a huge industrial complex built like a chocolate bar, tile after tile, and each time one of those tiles was completed, it was activated. One of the objectives was the production of synthetic rubber. They also produced fuel for aircraft engines starting in 1942, and today this factory continues to produce fuel, notably for rockets.
The plant belonged to E.G. Farben, a consortium of Germany's leading chemical companies.
Well, the IG Farben was a giant. It covered almost 90% of all needs of German chemical products. It was Agfa, it was Bayer, it was BASF, and some others.
Almost every German industry giant had a plant in Auschwitz and used concentration camp labor for this industrial development project.
The inmates were rented out to Buna by the camp administrators for 3 to 4 Reichsmarks per day, half the salary of an unskilled German worker. Less than a kilometer from the factory, the inmates of the camp worked on another construction site, a vast urban planning project for the Aryans.
We are in the middle of the IG Farben settlement that was built in order to make the future life of German settlers and the workers of the factory more comfortable.
This modern city planned to build 12 schools, 6 kindergartens, about 20 sports fields, cinemas, and hotels for a population that was to reach 40,000.
These plans have never been completed because of the lack of time and the lack of construction materials, bricks, reinforced steel, and so on.
In these houses, now inhabited by Polish families, 7,000 German settlers once lived. In the winter of 1945, as Nazi Germany was under attack on all fronts, the SS decided to erase the most compromising traces of their crimes. After blowing up the gas chambers and burning almost all of the camp's archives, they abandoned Auschwitz. On January 17th, the death marches began.
In light of the advance of the Soviets, 70,000 prisoners were forcibly evacuated, and after marches that lasted up to 15 days and included occasional stops in certain camps, they were transferred to the so-called camps of the Old Reich in mainland Germany, such as Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and others.
Historians estimate that a quarter of the detainees didn't survive the death marches. When the Red Army entered the camps 10 days later, only 6,000 to 7,000 detainees remained, too weak to be evacuated.
The dimension of Auschwitz has long escaped understanding and representation, given that the Soviets found the largest of all concentration camps totally empty, except for a few thousand people. This explains why, for several decades, Auschwitz was supplanted by the memory of other camps until the 1960s, before it gradually emerged as the international symbol of Nazi violence.
After Auschwitz I, Birkenau, and Monowitz, it took 4 months before all the other camps were liberated. In 4 years, the concentration camp and extermination system of Auschwitz caused more than 1,100,000 deaths, including 1 million Jews.
Auschwitz is the largest cemetery in Europe and probably the largest one on the planet.
In 1947, the Polish government decided to preserve the sites of Auschwitz and Birkenau. The other camps dependent on Auschwitz were gradually forgotten.
We should preserve the camp, undoubtedly. It's the place where it really happened. And having the stories, having the place, having the organized death factory, it's just the evidence of the crime committed, so it should be preserved.
Today, organizations and historians are fighting to preserve these remains in order to honor the memory of those who lost their lives in what was one of the worst Nazi concentration camp systems and killing centers.